Hey, welcome everybody. This is John Paul Mendocha with It's a Paul World. We've got a great interview for you today. We've got Wilfred Reilly, and Wilfred Reilly is a guy who's written a couple of very interesting books. We'll be talking about those in just a second. He's also going to be at FreedomFest, and we'll be talking about FreedomFest. And we're going to get hopefully some great insights from him and how he got started and all of that. But first off, let's get him on the show. So, Wilfred, thanks for joining me.
Yeah, great to be here.
So, what got you interested in, I mean, obviously your books, and maybe we should just pull out the first one, which is, hate crime hoax, how the left is selling a fake race war. So how'd you get into that? What made you say, I've got to write that book, or I got to pull that out?
Well, the edgy titles for books usually come from the publisher, although I don't have an objection to that one. I have a great relationship with Regnery. But the reason that I wanted to do an almost academic look at hate crime hoaxing was just that I noticed it a fair amount in my personal life. Like, I'm from Chicago originally, and when I was in graduate school, I was active in kind of the grad student community in that city. And within a period of maybe a year and a half, from like 2012 to 2014, there were a series of these widely reported awful hate crimes in Chicago. So the club Velvet Ultra Lounge, where I've had partners go to dance, I mean, very gay friendly, kind of a hipster bar in the inner suburbs, was burned to the ground. And these horrible anti-gay epithets, we're here for you queers and so on, were written through the building. And the suspicion obviously was that there'd been an arsonist who was targeting specifically gay people, like a crazy attempted murderer. And there were a couple more of these. I mean, like a guy named Derek Cockeline at the University of Chicago claimed that his Facebook page and his other social media had been hacked by this entire group of conservative activists, which he called the U Chicago Electronic Army, that were threatening him with murder, rape, just the most insane off the wall stuff. The FBI was called in for this one. There were a bunch more of these. At the University of Wisconsin Parkside, there were a series of nooses found throughout the campus. And that was followed up by a list of the names of all of the Black students on campus, or at least some prominent, popular Black students, under a headline like "Targeted for Death." So this was every couple of weeks, you'd see in the front pages of the Tribune or the Sun Times one of these stories. There's another one at Michigan Tech where a white student allegedly threatened to shoot everyone on campus. And the short version was that these were all bullshit, John. I mean, like the hate crime, the gay bar thing turned out to be the owner of the bar, who owed a bunch of money to people, apparently, which is something you don't always want to do in Chicago, set his own club on fire. He paid an arsonist who is his boy, a friend of his. They burnt the building down and then they wrote the stuff. This came out during a separate trial for like cross-state DUI. Wow. Like, just a young bunch of nightlife guys. The Wisconsin Parkside thing, which had been the one that actually did kind of emotionally disgust me. But the person who wrote the list turned out to be a member of this clique of sort of Black women. And the way she was identified was that her name was the only one spelled correctly on this list of 15 or 20 names. So they just went through, they interviewed everyone, and they found out that this particular person had to be the criminal. Like, her name and details were all on point. Everyone else's were just nonsense. So same thing with the University of Chicago thing. That kid, Cockeline, ironically, if he was going to talk about hackers and go to U Chicago, he didn't seem to know much about computers. So he used his own IP with no Tor, no VPN. This is like 2014, bear in mind, to message his other social media pages. And the FBI just solved this in 30 minutes. Like, this is amateur hour. And they brought the kid in, he confessed. But I mean, this, you have to understand, these were major. One of these made the Wall Street Journal. Like, this went on for a period of more than a year. And after that, and I mean, obviously, as an urban guy, I happen to be from the Black community. I'd been aware before this of Tawana Brawley. I'd been aware of Duke Lacrosse. I talked about the stuff in the barbershop. And I started asking the question, how often does this happen?
Right.
Like, what are the odds that of this series of, let's say, 5 graphic crimes, all of them would turn out to be fakes? The chances of that happening with murders are 0, with rapes or sexual assaults, very low. But with these flamboyant hate incidents, was all of them. So basically, the book was me using just standard first stage research techniques like Google Scholar with the research assistant, so on, looking through a progression of these hate crime cases and seeing how many of them turned out to be fakes within about the past 5 years, around the period I was writing the book. And the data set that I wound up with originally again, concentrated in, although not totally in 5 years, was 409 of these cases.
Wow.
So now there are only about 7,000 hate crimes reported in a typical year, and only about 10% of them get national media attention, which is my cutoff. So of a set of like 3,500 cases, we found that 400 of them were proven fakes. Like now there is some discussion about what a hate crime hoax means. So a lot of the people that study this professionally, which is a narrow, pretty left-leaning area of criminal justice, I mean, respected me as a scholar in terms of other things I've written, but did have some comments about, well, not all of those were hoaxes specifically by like the original victim claimant. Like some of them were hoaxes by someone like a partner of theirs. Others were just things where, like a rope was left on a construction site and a Black student activist said it was a noose. Is that a hoax? We can debate. But again, like 3,000 of the highest profile hate crime cases over the past 5 years, we know that 400 or 500 of them were not real. They're confirmed as not having happened. And this includes a lot of the very primary incidents that we discuss. I mean, Jussie Smollett, obviously. This would be more a hate incident, but you could throw Covington Catholic in here, the claim that these young high school kids surrounded a Native American Indian elder and threatened to take his sacred rain drum and so on. It never occurred. It was two males arguing for 30 seconds. Erica Thomas, the congresswoman that said she was attacked in an upper end grocery store, it was just BS. She got into a verbal argument with the guy who turned out to be a left-wing Cuban Democrat who came to her press conference and said what actually happened. Air Force Academy, where a general went and spoke out against racism among cadets. Turns out it's one of the most integrated environments in the country, and the guy made it all up. He was having trouble fitting in with his suite mates. Kansas State with like the horrible racial stuff written on cars. Drake University, Goucher College, and you notice all these are on college campuses, by the way.
Right.
But of these high-profile incidents, I mean, a very large number, we don't need to break down an exact percentage, but hundreds of them turned out not to be real, and not to be real very flamboyantly. Like Jussie Smollett co-hosted Good Morning America. Wow. So the question is, why is this happening? That's discussed in the book. Where is this most often happening? So that was hate crime hoax. I mean, the question was just, what's going on here?
So when you do that and you go through this and you start seeing this overwhelming evidence, clearly, the big flamboyant news story goes up, and when it all falls apart and it goes to shit, nobody reports it. Nobody really talks about this stuff. Nobody even remembers this stuff, and of course it doesn't fit any kind of narrative, so it kind of gets moved along. It goes into this other direction. So that to me is part of what lacks, that the credibility goes way down when you're looking at people who say, look at that all these things are on the rise, and that we've got this massive push on the rise. And what you're saying is that maybe not so fast. I mean, that when you told me about the guy, and burning down his own place, just kind of reminds me of my Vegas days, where I met a guy who was a professional at this, and of course, statutes are probably all wrapped up by now. But he said, that the saddest day in his arson career, as he was arson for hire in New York, is he'd walk in and he'd talk to a guy who had tried to hire him, because he always did an evaluation. I really liked the professionalism, Wilfred, that this guy took. And he said the saddest day is when you had to walk in and tell the guy, got some bad news, you're going to have to sell the property because it won't burn down. Yeah. So as soon as you said that, I thought,
in Chicago and Vegas, those guys are pros.
Oh yeah, exactly. So I mean, I'm not surprised that was the angle on that thing. Let's use that as our excuse. So, well, that's an interesting book to take off on. And so talk about, so you went through this, you did some of this study. So how did it change your perception of, I mean, is there a way that we could build a filter so when these things come out, because they always come out with just the slightest of facts, and now we get this thing going crazy, and how do we protect ourselves from this kind of inanity? I don't call it insanity, but it's inanity.
Do you mind if I get up for 1 second? There's someone knocking on my door for some reason.
Yeah, I mean, and hopefully it's not a hoax.
No,
sure. No, yeah, no. No. I'll hum a few bars while you're doing that. Let us hope, and if something happens to Wilfred, for all of you who are out here, we'll be contacting the authorities. We'll be parachuting somebody in. We'll make sure that he's taken care of and he's okay. So let's hope that there's not an issue whatsoever. and that this is just somebody, DoorDash is delivering his scrumptious lunch or something of that type, and we'll go from there. So this has been an interesting interview. We're talking to Wilfred Reilly. And for those of you who don't know, I'm John Paul Mendoza. This is It's a Paul World. And, hopefully you're having some fun. Hopefully you're hearing some interesting things. I find fascinating the kind of people who are going to be at Freedom Fest. By the way, if you have not taken the time to register, if you're not on your way to going to Freedom Fest, well, I'm going to tell you still have time to go. So from July 21st to the 24th is Freedom Fest. It's in Rapid City, South Dakota. I'm going to tell all of you how to get there. You do not need Google Maps. All you need to do is locate Interstate 90. Interstate 90 goes east and west. Hopefully you understand the points of a compass. Determine if you are either to the east or the west of Rapid City, and then go the appropriate other direction until you run into Rapid City. You will not miss it. It is the wide spot in the road in South Dakota, and you'll find Freedom Fest from July 21st to 24th. And now that we've taken care of that, we have had Wilfred return. DoorDash has now delivered his scrumptious lunch, hopefully, or something like that. And we will continue the interview. So welcome back, Wilfred.
Yeah, there's just some drunk guy outside. One of our neighbors would shoot him off the lawn. There's some kind of festival going on downtown. So sorry for that. Yeah, so they're not a thing at all.
There you go. Excellent. All right. So how can we protect ourselves? How do we build like some kind of filtration process so when these kinds of things pop up that we can then not get sucked into it? Because obviously they've got great emotional appeal for some people, and in fact they just kind of send people off in the wrong direction.
Well, I think it's very important for kind of adult taxpayers to look at the real numbers on a lot of these things. This is both of the books, actually, Hate, Crime, Hoax, and Taboo. We're in an era of these constant media-driven panics. Right. So, I mean, the Black Lives Matter movement is something that's talked about in the other book, Taboo. And this is the idea you frequently hear people openly say, like Chernobyl did on Fox National News, an unarmed Black man is murdered by the police every day, or more frequently than that. And there's a great deal of polling that finds that at least on the political left, people believe this. So the Skeptic Research Center, which I think is going to have some people at Freedom Fest actually, interviewed a bunch of mostly leftists and liberal young people and asked them how many unarmed brothers they think are shot in a typical year. And for people that identified as leftists or as very liberal, I believe it was 35% of them thought the figure was about 1,000.
Wow.
Another 15% thought the figure was about 10,000. And then 7% thought it was more than that. Now, to put that in context, there are only about 20,000 murders in a typical year, and only about half of them, although we are overrepresented, involve Black people at all. So, I mean, these numbers are just wildly off. But, and among regular liberals, like anything over to the center, I believe it was 26% thought it was 1,000, 7 or 8% thought it was 10,000, and 6 or 7% thought it was more than that. So, I mean, we have these constant narratives that are fed to us. Blacks and whites are going to war in the streets. Actors are being beaten up by guys in full-on Trump MAGA outfits in downtown Chicago. I recommend just looking at the actual facts, which are often pretty easily available. I mean, like the total number of hate crimes in a typical year is available from the FBI. Just Google FBI hate crimes year by year. You'll see it's under 10,000. You'll see that minorities are overrepresented in commission of them. So the idea that there's this nearly genocidal thing happening becomes harder to cling to. In the case of the African-American police shootings, when I started talking about, the actual number of unarmed Black men killed by cops last year was 18.
Wow.
It's hard to break down police units by race. You're normally talking about 2 or 3 officers in the car. But as far as I can tell, maybe 6 of them were shot exclusively by white guys or killed exclusively by white guys. So people believe the problem is, 10,000 per year. In fact, it's 6 per year. And that's true of a lot of these threats, whether you're talking about young child kidnapping, whether you're talking about totally non-political things, plane crashes, so on. So my suggestion to people would be skeptical and check out the actual data. Don't just, when you see MSNBC or even Fox presenting this constant wave of panic, the illegal aliens are coming, just think about what the actual reality is there. Is that something you're seeing in your environment at all? Right. If it is a little bit, check the data. What is it nationally? That would be my suggestion. Just be aware, be informed. Don't take the bait. Don't be afraid all the time so that you need the penis pill and the giant truck and all the crap they want to sell you.
Hang on now. Hang on. Some of those might be my clients. So let's not get onto sacred ground there now about not buying that pill. All right. So you're coming to Freedom Fest for the first time, and you're going to get to meet all of these kind of interesting libertarians and all of that. And what are you going to be talking about? What are you going to share with people? I know you're representing a group, and I want to make sure that we accurately describe who you're there for.
Yeah, so I mean, a lot of my speech is going to be about taboos and how they are used to generate this climate of fear and nonsense. I mean, all the things you can't talk about. So I'm gonna talk about BLM and what the actual numbers are. I'm going to talk about you constantly see the presentation continuing with the race theme, that there's this wave of interracial crimes, especially against minorities. So barbecue Becky and pool patrol Paula and the Central Park dog walking scandal and all this stuff. The reality is that interracial crime, or at least violent interracial crime involving blacks and whites, is about 3% of crime, first of all. There were 600,000 such crimes last year. That sounds like a lot, but there were 20 million crimes if you look at violent crime, serious property crime. So the two kind of oldest races in the country fighting one another, I guess, except for natives. But that's a very tiny percentage of crime. And if you want to talk about this fringe issue at all, it's 80% black on white. So the idea that there's this wave of minorities being attacked by like Beckys or Karens or whatever, white people that just hate us is just not real. So I mean, this is another taboo. And I'm going to discuss how real social action like restricting the police is based on this false belief, and so on through a bunch of other things, ranging from white privilege to some of the things the alt-right said diverse societies don't work. You can't tell that to the Roman Empire. But the more people believe things that aren't true, the more their behavior can be controlled. I even touch on COVID. Now, COVID was a deadly plague. I'm not one of those guys on sort of the edge right that denies it exists or anything like that. But I think when you ask the average American basic details about the coronavirus, they don't know them. The average American thinks the IFR, the infection fatality rate for COVID, is about 9%. It was 0.26%, I believe, when Reason combined the major papers, took a 10-page look at this. So about 1 in 1,000 people in the USA actually died during COVID-19. Like actual death toll from last year, the start of this year, was 345,000. That's terrible. But as usual, 3.1 million people overall died. So, I mean, the average COVID-19 victim was 82. People, again, are not aware of this at all. And just so on down the line, so if you think that 9% of the country is dead, I don't know how you could, looking around, but maybe you just haven't left home. But if you believe this, then obviously that's going to encourage support for lockdowns, and it's going to encourage, for example, what you're saying with the Weinsteins right now, the banning of fairly mainstream discussion of things like treatment. So I'm going to talk about taboos, how they're founded in beliefs that are almost entirely wrong, and what effect that has. And the effect it has is usually kind of quelling conversation. Like if you really believe the issue in the hood is the police as opposed to black or mob or whatever else crime, and you view it as something you're going to get punished for to say anything else, I mean, you're going to end up with a series of solutions that don't make a lot of sense and won't address the real problem. So I'm going to talk about that, although a little more focused. And the organization I'm there representing is FAIR, which is the Foundation Against Intolerance and Racism. That doesn't necessarily have a ton to do with my speech, but I'm going to do some networking for them. The FAIR, Foundation Against Intolerance and Racism, great group. It was started by Barry Weiss after kind of ostracism from the New York Times. And the idea was, why isn't there an organization that opposes just sort of racism broadly? So, I mean, some of the things you're seeing on the far right, the alt-right, Groyper movement, so on, but also the more prevalent CRT woke nonsense you're seeing on the left, and all the white kids in the class have to kneel down and apologize. Why doesn't someone just say, well, we think people should in general be treated like countrymen, like citizens. We're against all of this. We're against segregation of people, would be a very basic example in any case. And so that is fair. The group is, I mean, the board goes from Megyn Kelly, Glenn Lowry, and right of that actually, over to, I mean, people like Barry that just basically oppose bigotry. So that's the capacity in which I'll be there.
Well, excellent. And do you know if they're going to have a booth, or are you a one-man wrecking crew?
No, we've got a booth. I actually was part of some of the emails where we kind of negotiated this, like what's the booth rate, and so on. Do we get pins and hats and stuff?
Oh, yeah.
So we will have a fair booth. I think we have pins. I don't think we have hats. But we've got the fair paraphernalia. There also is I think we own fair and fairforall.com. Let's take a look at the foundation. Intolerance.
Well, and the best part about going to Freedom Fest is it I highly encourage you to go meet with every group and go meet with the fair people. I'm going to be there and start talking to people, because that's one of the best parts about Freedom Fest is that if you want to go get into a serious discussion, and to me, that's the exciting part, is you can actually have a discussion in a environment that you're not going to have somebody go, "Ooh, look out. That person said one trigger word and we're done." So it's a great environment. All right. So what website do we have that we can point people to?
It's just fairforall.org, www.fairforall.org, and you should be able to get some basic swag there now if you want. But more importantly, look at the board, which includes, I mean, really a whole range of people. Like I'm hitting board of advisors right now. I mean,
That's great.
Coleman Hughes. Oh yeah, I mean, Ayan Hersey Ali, Peter Boghossian, Melissa Chin, Niall Ferguson, Angel Eduardo, and so on down the line until, obviously the best of the lot, me. But Stephen Pinker, John McWhorter, Chris Rufo, Kenny Shue, so many to Andrew Sullivan, Abigail Schreier. So, I mean, just a pretty good lineup of sort of normal people, left and right, that are against some of the nonsense in society right now. Which, again, a lot of this consists of a very specific thing, which is people being polarized, black, white, left, right, so on, by fear, mostly about bullshit, mostly about things that aren't real. So if I truly believe there was a race war going on between whites and blacks, I'd have to pick a side, probably the black one. We'd all fight, but there's not. Again, the person most likely to kill you is your ex-wife. Interracial violent crime is 3% of crime. It's 80% black on white. Like, it's just not going on. The things that are presented by the mass media to the average taxpayer are just nonsense. They're not real. And that's what people, in the non-racist adult sense, that's what people mean by red pilling, where you're watching the media and you realize that everything you're hearing is a lie. I mean, like claims like there's no critical theory in our schools, just nonsensical stuff. And the moment you become aware of that and you say, oh, these are for-profit, amoral businesses, one leans left, one leans right, I'm going to go to the library, that you've just made a pretty significant gain of function for yourself there.
Well, and it sounds like it's going to be a very interesting and lively discussion. Now, we have to do a little quick shout out for our friends at Freedom Fest. So and you can participate if you want to or you don't want to. This is I'm a libertarian. So but what I want to do is ask you, so why should somebody come and listen to you at Freedom Fest and come to Freedom Fest and make it to South Dakota and all of that? So what's your take of that, Wilfred?
I mean, you should come to Freedom Fest because it's one of the leading sort of most fun events of this kind. I mean, you talked about it with me, this sort of mostly libertarian giant convo, and a non-cheap place to stay that happens to have a bar that has some of the best speakers in the game. I mean, that's why you should come to an event like this one. Why should you listen to me? Because I'm an enjoyable guy to listen to. I'm an excellent, fairly well-trained public speaker, but also because I don't think most people know these facts. I mean, so there's an element of wonkery to this. I mean, when I say the total number of unarmed brothers killed by white police officers is 6, I don't think most people know that. So there's an element of gaining ammunition for some of this stuff from FAIR. I mean, so this is precisely what's being taught in the schools. This is the actual number of these interracial crimes. This is what you can confront someone with in terms of reality when they start telling you sort of the blue pill nonsensical narrative. So that's why you should come listen to me, and you should come to Freedom Fest overall because it'll be fun.
Well,
you'll learn.
There's no better reason to do that. And of course, it's July 21st to the 24th in Rapid City, South Dakota. Well, so wrap this up. Just give us one of the 10 taboos, 10 facts you can't talk about, which is your latest book. Give us a single taboo that you can't talk about, that you obviously you take a lance and poke through that falsehood. So which is one that you want to pick? Give us one, please.
Sure, of course. And I actually have gotten teased about that a little bit in some book reviews and so on. One British guy called me something like that American Pratt that wrote a best-selling book about how he can't talk. And there is an element of humor with some of these center-right books about this. Like, I mean, Michael Knowles' Speechless, #1 on the Amazon bestseller list. So it's honestly not all that hard to get your point across. I'm talking about major radio station. I mean, it's not that hard to get your point across if you're on the left or the right, frankly, in a free country. But I mean, let's ensure that it stays that way. There are very serious issues when it comes to censorship and so on. But in terms of one of the points of taboo, one of the most basic, again, wonky, but entertaining, and something I don't think most people know, the entire concept of systemic racism is, again, nonsensical. Like the idea, when you hear someone like Ibram Kendi talk, is that there must be this very pervasive, hard to find racial prejudice throughout American society. And his evidence for that is basically just that there are performance differences between groups. So these guys will often mention the SAT, for example. You know, whites get a 11, 18, blacks below that, Hispanics below blacks in some years. The black score is 950 last I looked. The reason for that must be some kind of hidden prejudice. The test must be biased. What I find in the book, doing actual fairly serious science, is that almost every one of these claims collapses if you adjust for sort of non-racial things that vary between racial groups. So when it comes to the SAT, the one thing that they always admit is that Asians beat everybody by hundreds of points. The Asian score is about 1,200. And it turns out that if you adjust for one simple thing, which is how much people study for the test, especially study for the test with their dad, or study in school, I don't want to oversimplify this, but that closes almost all grading and test score gaps. It's incredibly simple. You'll do well on tests depending on how much you study for them. This goes on more broadly. So if you look at income in the United States, which is the big thing that's usually used to demonstrate systemic racial prejudice, you find that all gaps between whites, blacks, Asians, etc., vanish if you adjust for very simple things like age and the region people live in, test scores people got in the past. The most common age for a black man, which you can find just by Googling most common age by race, is 27. For a white guy, it's 58. That's not exactly the median, but still over 30 years, hopefully you'll accumulate some resources unless you're a complete failure. So that's kind of the core of the book, that a lot of these simplistic things in society, again, it gets back to the idea of being blue-pilled, believing this narrative. A lot of these things that people say in society, well, there's this gap between people that must be due to either brutal racism or maybe genetics on the racist fringe. Almost all of them vanish if you actually start doing science and you adjust for very basic stuff like how old people are. So that's, I'd say, one of the core taboos in the book, that most of what you're seeing when people just compare white guy and black guy along one measure is totally meaningless. And that understanding that takes you down the road of, now, how do I find out what the reality is? What is the age? What's the income? Where do people live? So on down the line. So that is one thing I would take from taboo if I took anything.
Well, it's interesting that you brought up the SAT, and you brought up, you know, what that culture is or what that environment is that you live in. And I, you know, in my other life, I actually am involved in a technology company, and our best customer is, in fact, is Korean, and he lives in the US, but he's Korean. And when he describes what he does with and this is several years ago, with his 8 and 10-year-old, is that every day he would get home. Now, here's a guy who speaks Korean, writes Korean, reads Korean, speaks English, writes English, thinks in English, or whatever that might be. And he's got 3 degrees. I mean, we're not talking about, like, you know, some kind of crazy degree. And he sits down with his 2 children every single night. His wife, by the way, is teaching them Korean. Now, they live in Southern California. And he asks them how well they do, and he works with them on their schoolwork every single night. Mm-hmm. And he as we were sitting at lunch one day, and he you know, this just bubbled up out of him, and he said, I always ask my son and my daughter, so how did you do in school? And what, you know, how did you score on the test? And they will tell me. And he goes, okay, but how did you do versus your other, you know, your other students? And he started telling his son, who was then 10, when he was 6, don't worry about the white kids. Don't worry about the Hispanic kids. Don't worry about the black kids. How well are you doing vis-a-vis the Chinese and Japanese? Those are the guys you got to beat. You got to beat those people. And I looked at him, I said, well, it's fascinating because, of course, being a consultant in the marketing space, here's an interesting little factoid, which is in 1950, there weren't enough Koreans to really measure in the United States. In 1980, the census showed that there were 0.7% of the state of California were Koreans, and they controlled 3% of the wealth in California. 30 years. And this is the guy who's driving that home. And he is driving that home every single day. And I said, so about how many hours a week do you think you're like training your children? And he goes, shooting for 20 hours a week. They're 8 and 10 years old, Wilfred, 8 and 10 years old. I mean, do you have any doubt or have any sense that when they get to college age that they're not going to do very well in the SAT and that they're going to get real degrees and they're going to get real jobs? I don't, because that commitment is so critical and so important.
Yeah, I mean, I think that in social science, we talk about what's sometimes called the crit culturalist hereditarian debate, which I'm a culturalist. But the basic question is Dr. Kendi's question, like, are differences in performance between large groups, are they due to racism, which is sort of the current politically correct explanation? Are they due to genetics, or are they due to differences in behavior? And I think if you've ever spent any time actually watching Asian or Nigerian communities, I mean, Nigerians to some extent are just Black guys. Like, that's the region of West Africa most Black Americans came from. Like, these aren't necessarily wildly exotic people. But what you see is that there's an incredible amount of focus on things that actually will make you successful. Like yesterday, something incredibly unusual happened because the winner of the Scripps National Spelling Bee wasn't Indian American. It had been an immigrant from either India or East Asia for the past, forgive me if I'm wrong, but 19 years, something like that. And the other day, it was a pleasant, upper middle class Black girl. Good job, legacy Americans. But there's obviously no gene for spelling words in a different language. I think that the clear factor there is that your father and mother make you spend an hour a night before you go out to play or whatnot, memorizing and practicing these words.
Right.
So whether or not racism still exists at the margin, certainly against Black people, whether or not there's some 1% genetic differences like you see in the Olympic marathon, most likely, so on down the line, the simple reality is that the average person could pretty easily get to an 1100 SAT, 6-minute mile, so on, average middle class guy, if they busted their rear the way immigrants to this country do. So, I mean, that's something that's discussed in the book. But beyond my own admiration for immigrant culture, which it seems like you share, there's a more basic point, which is that mostly when you look at discussions of race, for example, comparisons between whites and Blacks, you're looking at one data point. Someone will say there's a difference in wealth between white and Black Americans, and then they'll go on to glibly attribute that to either 1, racism, or 2, genetics. It's as regular as clockwork. The reality is that groups that differ in terms of something as important as race or religion also differ in terms of a whole bunch of other, what you could call social, cultural variables. And adjusting for those always closes every gap. You sometimes find a 4% difference, which might be like the residual effect of racism. But if you adjust for how old people are, where they live, and how they're doing in school, you pretty much predicted their income. It really is that simple. So that's one of the points of taboo, that instead of believing, and you almost get back to Christianity in the past, instead of believing at the broad narrative in society, which everyone tells you have to believe is correct, you could just look at how things seem to work. And that's essentially what happened in the Enlightenment. People stopped paying attention to what the Bible said, and they started looking at how the planets moved and how things progressed when they fell from towers and so on. And I'm being very glib here, but within a certain quick period of time, they discovered science, because it turned out that the entire previous body of knowledge, an unchaste woman is a whore and all this sort of stuff, had nothing to do with how actual scientific principles operate. And I would say the same thing is true with a great deal of quote unquote wokeness today, among other ideologies. You could get rid of the entire body of it and not lose anything.
Interesting. Well, I just want to wrap up by saying, any last comments? I mean, you're obviously, if you go and see Wilfred, here's what I can tell you from my short time that I've gotten to know him, is that he is a man who likes to talk, and I like people who like to talk. Any last words before we wrap up?
I mean, I think my last, buy hate crime, hoax, and taboo and come to FreedomFest. But no, more broadly, although that is probably the more sincere of these two things, both are quite sincere. But I mean, more broadly, I think use logic, obtain knowledge, and try to see what's actually true in the world. The majority of the major narratives in society right now, from the BLM narrative to the broader story about racial conflict, systemic racism, the counterpoints on the right that I've talked about, those aren't true. So look for what is.
And with that, I just want to thank Wilfred Reilly for being my guest today. And you can see him at Freedom Fest 2021. And I hope to see you at Freedom Fest 2021. If you have not purchased his books, my suggestion is that you go and check them out, go pick them up, and also go check out FAIR. Sounds like a really great group that has come together and said, let's look at this from a better position. Thank you, Wilfred Reilly, and you have a great day.
You too. Thanks for having me on.